Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to talk this morning a little bit about why do we take the Bible seriously? I mean, we all do, and yet I'd like to stand back a little bit and re-examine some of the reasons we really do that. And I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about this watch. I have a wristwatch, and it has the typical features of a watch. If I told you that this watch was the result of a handful of engineers carefully, skillfully designing it, that gave those specifications to some highly skilled technicians and craftsmen that assembled it, made the parts and fitted them together and assembled it, and ended up giving that to a jobber who gave it to a wholesaler who gave it to a retail store that my wife went and purchased it and gave it to me as a gift, how many would believe me? It's interesting how gullible you are, because that's not what happened at all. You see, what actually happened is billions of years ago, there were some random atoms floating through the universe. And through the winds of change and the accident of circumstance, some of these atoms came together to make a crystal, and others came together to make a set of hands. And I can go on, and you're already smiling. It's obviously absurd, isn't it? It's awfully hard to explain how it says that it's Sunday, November 20th, all by accident. You see, we smile at the absurdity that this wristwatch could be the result of random chance. And yet it resides on a wrist that's actually vastly more complicated than the wristwatch, because the wristwatch is an open design. The wrist is a closed-loop servo. And there's probably not one engineer in 100 that knows how to do a Nyquist diagram to resolve the feedback loops of a closed-loop servo. And yet, not only is the wrist a closed-loop servo, it adjusts itself to different ambient temperatures. It'll repair itself when there's injury. You know, you start looking at this as an engineer would. The wrist represents several orders of magnitude more complex engineering than the wristwatch. How bizarre it is that we accept the idea that a wristwatch cannot happen by accident. It has to be the result of design. Then why not the wrist upon which it resides? Or the body with its eyes and its ears? And we could go on, the breathtaking miracle of the bodies which we enjoy. Obviously the result of highly skilled engineering. And it's interesting how we're put upon by our culture, by our schools, by the pagan left, to buy this idea that we're all here as a random accident. Very strange. You know, if you were an astronaut landing on a planet for the first time, and you were walking in your spacesuit, and you down there in the sand looked down and picked up a wristwatch, could you possibly explain it being there other than intelligent life having put it all together and left it there? Do you follow what I'm saying? Interesting thing. You know, the scientists, even the secular scientists, as they address the problem of trying to build a mathematical model of the universe, as they try to take all that we know physically of the Earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, and put it into a computer model to try to play around with the parameters, they discover something very strange. They discover that every number, every detail, every ratio that they encounter is a result of very delicate balance. And they call this discovery the anthropic principle. They discover in science that if you try to address the way our universe that's around us is designed, you discover that you can't change anything without wrecking it. For example, if the Earth was a little bit closer to the sun, it would be too warm to endure the water cycle that makes life possible on the Earth. If it's just a little bit further from the sun, it gets too cold. If it's a little bigger, a little smaller, you can actually list hundreds of examples of this. the surface gravity, the distance from the sun, the thickness of its crust, the rotational speed, the magnetic field, the lunar gravitational attraction, the axial tilt, the albedo, that is the reflectivity, the oxygen to nitrogen ratio, the carbon dioxide level, the water vapor levels, the water thermal expansion behavior. Some of these parameters are so delicate that if you change them as little as 1 part in 10,000, life ceases to exist on the planet Earth. And they discover, as they examine all this, that we are the result of an extremely delicate balance. Not only the result of engineering, but highly skilled, careful attention. You often hear people concerned about the ozone layer. If it changes by 1/10 of 1%, it brings cosmic doom. If you turn that around, you have to ask the question, how did it get so precisely balanced in the first place? But by engineering. And we could go on. We, in fact, have built a whole briefing on this called the anthropic principle. It's in a briefing package called Beyond Coincidence, which demonstrates, if you just look around, the fantastic nature of the world in which we live. That leads us to another issue. There seems to be in our culture a widely held view that we're here as the result of evolution. And one of the questions we can't help but ask ourselves if we're thinking human beings, is evolution a viable concept? You see, many would have you believe that life came about, it just happened, by simply taking some matter, some material, and some energy. If you take matter and energy and put it together, eventually, if you do that often enough, you'll cause new life to be created. That's basically the premise of biological evolution, that life, biogenesis, just happened on its own. Now you're probably wondering why we have a jar of peanut butter on the platform. That was to get your attention and distract you during the worship, I understand. Now this is not only a jar of peanut butter, it's a brand new one. We picked it up at the market on the way over here. And I want to share some things with you. See, this jar of peanut butter, it happens, interestingly enough, to be a open thermodynamic system. What that means is there's some material in the jar, and energy can enter and leave the jar. What I mean by that is it can get warmer, it can get colder. And you can warm it up all you like, and you can cool it all you like, and it also happens to be optically open. You have light that enters the jar and so forth. Now, if the evolutionists are right, occasionally the following thing should happen. You see, if I open this jar, as I often do when I'm pressed to make a sandwich, and I lift this up, what's the chance, what's the probability that I'll discover inside this jar some new life form? And we look down there, and much to my relief, there's no new life form. I say that not only scientifically, but Lou's known I've done this before, and I figured one of these days he's going to slip in some kind of creepy, crawly creature just to throw me off balance when I'm up here. Now, this may sound like a silly example. If evolution was plausible, maybe not very often, but there'd be the possibility. Because, see, I've got matter in here. In fact, I even have a handicap because the matter in here is organic matter. I should be using inorganic matter, but I've allowed that. You see, matter plus energy can never equal life. There's a missing element. You need matter plus energy plus another factor, some information. There's some information you need to create life. Now that can occur by a contaminant, a spore, or a germ or something can create that information that will cause some life form to continue. But life cannot be created on its own for lots of reasons. Now, this may sound like a silly example, but I want you to realize that for over 100 years, the food industry has relied on the fact that evolution is not only unlikely, it's impossible. If evolution was possible, you could not go to the store and with safety purchase a food product without the danger of it harboring some previously unknown life form. We create over 1 billion experiments per year demonstrating that the basic premise of evolution is not only unlikely, it's impossible. And now, from now on, every time you open a jar of baby food or a jar of peanut butter, I want you to remember that evolution is a fraud. Evolution is foolishness. Now, as we look through the sciences, you can examine every field of science and discover that evolution is impossible. Let's take just the general physical sciences. If you take even some of the simplest probabilities that are required for the design we experience to be here by accident, you quickly get to numbers that are 10 to the 100th power or more. There's a problem with that. If you try to imagine some organism that is going to try to multiply itself and make a different organism, they say, well, it can mutate or there can be an accident. The first question you got to ask yourself is, how many tries will you allow it to do that? How many generations will it take? Well, one of the questions you might, first of all, try to get in perspective is how many generations of life forms have occurred in the history of the universe. Let's assume for the moment the scientists are correct saying the universe is, say, 15 billion years old. Question is, what is the average lifespan of an organism in the history of the universe? Well, some small life forms have very short lifetimes. Let's assume that the average lifetime was as small as 1 second. How many lifetimes have there been in the history of the universe? The answer will surprise you, only 10 to the 18th. Only 10 to the 18th seconds have occurred in 15 billion years. Suppose that you said, well, gee, maybe in the ancient past there are life forms that had a lifetime, a generation, as short as 1/1,000,000th of a second. Well, then it's 10 to the 18th times 10 to the 6th, so you're only talking 10 to the 24th. Let's assume the average lifetime was 1/1000,000th of a second. That's only 10 to the 25th. Point is, you see, the first thing you discover that even if you grant some of the implausible hypotheses of evolution, there first of all wasn't enough time. There's another part of the problem that everybody overlooks. There's not enough matter. If you're going to take some tries, make some experiments to try to get that random accident that causes something to appear to be designed, how many tries are you going to allow yourself? And, well, there's not enough time. There's also not enough material. You can quickly come to the conclusion mathematically you need over 10 to the 100th, several hundred power. More than that, actually. But the point is, the first question you have to ask yourself is, how many atoms are there in the entire universe? They know. They've made a very, very educated guess. There's only 10 to the 66th atoms in the entire universe. So if you take particles, the subparts of an atom, there's only 10 to the 80th. So the first thing you discover if you start exploring this thing honestly, there's not enough material, there's not enough time to even have the accident of random occurrence cause these things to happen. But let's get back to organic chemistry. Organic chemistry totally destroys the concept of evolution. In organic chemistry, the key to life turns out to be one of the basic building blocks of things called amino acids. It turns out that an amino acid, because of the structure of the molecule, it's asymmetrical. It can either be left-handed or right-handed. It turns out that if amino acids occurred by accident, by happenstance, you would expect that half of the amino acids floating around would be left-handed molecules and the others would be right-handed molecules. It turns out that all living things are made up of left-handed molecules, which statistically is absurd. There should be half and half. See, aren't there some right-handed molecules? Yes, there are. There are a few. It turns out the right-handed molecules are toxic to life. I'll give you some examples of right-handed molecules. Strychnine, brucine, and others are right-handed molecules. And I could give you some other examples. I don't want to get too technical here. But, you know, they always imagine the monkeys on the typewriters. If you had a room full of monkeys typing typewriters, after eventually they'd produce one of Shakespeare's sonnets or something. How far would a monkey get doing that if every odd-numbered key on the typewriter was fatal to the monkey? Doesn't work, does it? See, if half the amino acids are toxic to the other half amino acids, how are you going to have life? There's another problem. They always imagine that somehow these molecules were in some pool of water and lightning flashed and that caused life to occur. Well, that's a rather specious argument. If the amino acids occur in the presence of oxygen, they have degradation or oxidation, so you can't have oxygen present. If you have an oxygen-free atmosphere at some point, it turns out that you have no ozone and the ultraviolet radiation would have killed it. So it turns out you lose both ways. But there's another part of the problem. You always see in the schools, you have these little equations which talks about amino acids yield, with the arrow on a chemistry diagram, yield polypeptides plus water. And so what bothers me about this discovery, or this presentation you get in school, it's first-year chemistry, is that it turns out that these equations are what they call reversible. The arrow is always double-directed. So if you're going to take amino acids and get polypeptides, you have to remove the water to drive the equation to the right. And any chemistry prof knows that, which means the amino acids, if they were ever to occur, have to occur in the absence of water. You have to remove the water to cause the equation to go to the right, which tells you something else. Not only are your high school textbooks wrong, they are deliberate frauds. I made my 30-year career in the securities industry, in the corporate industry, and there are laws that if you deliberately mislead, publish things that are wrong in the securities field, you go to jail. If those laws applied to the publishers of high school textbooks, there would be publishers serving jail sentences, because the kinds of materials that are typically promoting this idea are not only wrong, they're deliberate frauds. But we could move on. It turns out to get amino acids to create proteins requires amazingly precise manufacture. Approximations don't work, which means that trial and error methods don't work. It takes a result of a great deal of skill. But perhaps cutting through of this, the most extreme example of this was discovered in 1958 when Watson and Crick discovered the DNA molecule. Most of us have heard today about the DNA molecule, how it, in every cell in our body, has DNA, and the DNA includes a code, a coded history, genetic history of your entire family tree. Everything about you, that is you. Those peculiar physical characteristics that distinguish you from your sister or your brother or so forth, and yet those characteristics that also give you a family resemblance, all those subtleties, everything about you is coded in the DNA molecule. Now, why is that such a big deal? It turns out that the DNA molecule is a digital code. A digital code. Now, the computer engineers, if there's any among us, are immediately struck by the significance of that. If you're going to design a computer, you design the language first, then you design the hardware that will process the language. They're separate design problems. They can't evolve independent of one another. They have to be skillfully coordinated together. Give you a simple example. Paul Revere, waiting on the banks, looking across at the Old North Church, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Remember the famous event? What was he doing there? What is the significance about 1 lamp or 2 in the Old North Church? It was a prearranged code, a digital code, which would tell him how the British were coming. That occurs because there's previous agreement. If I had a blackboard here and wrote an M, an A, and an N, what does that mean? Man. Why? Because we've previously agreed as to what those symbols mean. That's what we call language. Language has to be designed. Machines that process language have to be designed to process that machine. Well, the point is, the DNA molecule is in code, a digital code, a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code. It's been designed to correct errors that will accommodate the errors that are available in the ambient radiation. It can accommodate a 1 or 2% error. And I won't get into the whole nucleides and all of the DNA thing, other than to point out that the DNA molecule is a scathing indictment of even the plausibility of evolution. That's why there's no interspecies and so forth. It's all digital. And the fact that this DNA is a digital code has staggering significance for all of us. Well, to move on beyond this sort of thing, there's another aspect of the Bible. Not only is the Bible correct, the Bible, which describes all this, by the way, But going beyond this, the Bible has anticipated all the scientific discoveries. We feel very proud of our Western civilization and our heritage, and yet it's interesting that the more we learn about science, the more we learn about our universe, the more we learn about ourselves, every time we look